Don't call it a coup, a military takeover in Thailand without spilling any blood. The army saying it wants to end 6 months of protests and hold new elections. Right now, the international hotspot, Bangkok, Thailand. Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Franzen in New York. Thailand under the control of the military, but the army saying it's not a coup. What's more surprising is the reaction of the people in Bangkok. Folks in Thailand reacting to the military takeover by taking selfies. The calm nature of the non-coup has led to hundreds of people lining up at barricades with selfies taken with the soldiers. The army says it declared martial law because of the street protests that have lasted more than 6 months and without a proper functioning government. The military says it wants to restore order to the country. The BBC's Jonah Fisher has this report from Bangkok.
After 7 months of demonstrations on the streets of the Thai capital, the army decided it had seen enough. In the early hours of this morning, troops moved in, blocking Bangkok streets, surrounding protest sites and occupying television stations. Army Commander Prayut Chan-o-cha declared that martial law had been introduced to prevent bloodshed and to restore stability, he said. He stopped short of announcing a coup. But the military is now firmly in charge and the status of the elected government vague. It's not clear what forced the army's hand, but as Bangkok's protests have dragged on, they've become ever more violent and unpredictable. This week, the leader of the anti-government movement, Suthep Thaugsuban, called for a final battle in what has become an increasingly desperate attempt to seize power. Many of his supporters are wealthy Bangkok residents, and they see politics as having been hopelessly corrupted by the former Prime Minister, Thaksin Shinawatra. 2 weeks ago, a court forced Thaksin's sister, Yingluck, to step down, but the protests have continued. Much will now depend on how the government's supporters, for now camped outside Bangkok, respond to the army's move.
For now, there is an almost eerie calm here. Many of the soldiers have returned to barracks, and on the surface at least, this is a very discreet form of martial law. But having decided to step in, the onus is now very much on the Thai military to try and broker some sort of way out of Thailand's political crisis. Jonah Fisher, BBC News, Bangkok.
And we are joined now by Financial Times Bangkok regional correspondent Michael Peel via Skype. Michael, calm at the moment in Bangkok, but will it stay that way?
Well, this is the big question. The troops deployed this morning and under martial law, and the day was actually pretty normal. People were on the streets working as usual, which I think people would have expected because, of course, the army ordered protests to stop. It took TV stations from both sides of the political divide off the air, and the generals say this is all about stability and, you know, ending this corrosive crisis in the country. But of course, it's a big call to make, and they are now sort of going to be held to that. And if they're seen to be biased in favour of one side, and of course traditionally they're seen as very much leaning towards the opposition and anti-government protesters, then we could see trouble to come. And of course, some people are very unhappy with the sweeping powers which the military has given itself under this law.
Yeah, with all of that going on, you mentioned many things seem normal, including people going out and taking selfies with the military.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, well, this has very much been a selfie crisis all the way through, particularly the opposition in their heartland of Bangkok. You know, they post a lot on Instagram. Indeed, sometimes certain protests they try and flood Instagram and, you know, get to the top of the rankings on that. So that's been something that's happened all the way through, and it shows, I think, that this is a strange crisis because well, on the one hand, people talk about, oh, we must proceed according to the Constitution and the rule of law and all the rest of it. Actually, if you look at events here, the raw politics has left the constitution and the rule of law in second place, in a distant second place on many occasions. And you look at the way the street protesters have been acting. They've cordoned off areas of the city. They've shot and wounded passers-by who go too close to their territory. You hear a lot of hate speech from opposition rally stages, and then on the other hand, you hear, you see that opposition rally sites have been attacked in mysterious grenade and gun attacks, but no one's ever arrested or held accountable for any of this, and it adds to a feeling that the rule of law is really sort of sliding away here.
And all of that, of course, taking place right now. But 6 months ago, those intense rallies and crackdowns began. Why has the military waited so long to react?
Well, the military historically has been very powerful in Thailand. No fewer than 18 times since 1932 has it attempted coups, and actually more often than not it's been successful. But things changed quite a lot in 2006, which was the last coup here, when the military ousted Thaksin Shinawatra, who was the prime minister then, who'd won 2 comprehensive election victories, largely on his appeal to rural poor Thais, and he offered subsidised healthcare, generous agricultural subsidies, and so on. He was removed by the military, and I think they felt burned by that because they got a lot of criticism from outside Thailand, and also, more importantly, they really sparked the so-called red shirt movement, which is loyal to Mr. Thaksin and his parties broadly, and that has become a real force in Thai politics. And I think they feel if they intervene directly again, they will be blamed for what goes wrong afterwards. Previously, in 2008, that crisis, the coup against Mr. Thaksin, led to the installation of a very unstable opposition government, and that all ended very badly in 2010. Thaksin supporters occupied parts of Bangkok. The military waded in to end that and ended up killing scores of people. So I think that senior commanders want to avoid that, and also there's a pragmatic consideration that, as we've seen in other countries, if something is clearly a military coup and is branded as such, then that can create problems with, for example, getting aid from the United States, military aid, because of provisions there are about what happens to that aid in the event of a coup in a country that the United States offers military assistance to. So for all of those reasons, the generals have been biding their time before doing this.
You mentioned, Michael, red shirts, and we see in the protests and in the rallies this feud between the red shirts and the yellow shirts. What do they represent?
Well, the yellow shirts, broadly, the opposition movement, is backed by the country's traditional establishment and its allies. It's not quite as simple as that. They have backing in South Thailand, and some of those are not wealthy Thais. But at its core, it very much represents the old royalist, militarist Thai elite, and it emerged from the era of feudal absolute monarchy that Thailand was in for a long time, until 1932. And this is a very powerful core, and it maintains control over a lot of the country's main institutions, and that's at the heart of a lot of this crisis, that it's not just the actions of the military but the actions of the courts, which have sacked 3 prime ministers in 6 years, one of them for taking money for appearing on a cookery TV show, and which is pretty extraordinary in a democracy, that the courts just wade in and take out an elected leader like that. But on the other side, you have the so-called red shirts, who rose to prominence after the arrival on the Thailand political scene of Thaksin Shinawatra, who's a plutocrat, a telecoms mogul, who basically realized that he could get power in Thailand by appealing to the vast mass of poor rural Thais who had pretty much been ignored by government over the years. And he proved spectacularly successful in this with policies such as subsidized healthcare and rice subsidies, microcredit, and so on. And he won an election victory in 2001, and his parties that back him have won every election that's been held since. And so the traditional elite is scratching its head a bit here, that they're thinking, well, how can we win power in an election? And they haven't proven able to do so. So what has happened instead is that you've seen the army or the courts moving in and taking out pro-Thaksin governments, either by a military coup or by a so-called judicial coup. But of course, what then happens is if they install the yellow shirts, elite-backed politicians, that as soon as there's an election, the Thaksin people come back. And so Thailand is stuck in this cycle and really has a very deep identity crisis, which at its heart is all about the kind of society that Thailand and wants to be and Thais want to see, and about how power is distributed and held and exercised in this country.
So, of course, the military calling it martial law, coups very much a part of Thailand's history. What do you think will happen in the coming weeks?
Well, there are a couple of directions it could go in. I mean, the benign view of what's happened is that, to take what the military says at face value, and to that what now follows is a period where temperatures cool, there is some kind of political mediation, and this crisis gets back on the track of talks and negotiation rather than violence on the streets. But it's pretty hard to see that happening, because you have two sides who are very entrenched in their positions, and it's really tough to see how some kind of compromise would even start to be made. So fundamentally apart are they? The less benign interpretation is that what the military has done is actually, although the generals deny this, is actually part of an orchestrated attempt by Thailand's elite to mount a kind of slow motion coup in which they squeeze life and power from this government, which has already been hobbled by 6 months of protests. It's been crippled by the courts. The government tried to hold an election in February. The opposition sabotaged it, and then the courts came out and annulled the election, saying that, well, because the election couldn't be held in some places because of opposition sabotage, therefore the whole election was scrapped, which some commentators here said was effectively giving a green light to protesters to sabotage elections, and was basically a very bad day for democracy in Thailand. So that's another scenario that is possible, could play out from here. And at this very early stage, it's hard to see which way it will go. And but at the same time, clearly there are worries about. Understandably, the military has taken power and now has these sweeping powers, which it's promised to use responsibly. But of course, we've heard that in coups in other places before, and the reality turns out to be something different. So
and Michael,
that's what people are looking for now.
Real quickly, give me an idea. How big of a role do you think social media is playing in this, with the world watching?
It's important, and Thais are as hungry as anyone else for the social media, and in a sense that there's a slightly retro feel to what's happened today, because the army is concentrated on TV stations so far, which but this is not 1990, so. So far, social media seems to be working fine, and obviously people are debating this censorship very hotly at the moment. And I think one of the worries that people have is, well, we've seen this in other countries where there have been uprisings or crises where the government or the military has just decided to block Facebook, Twitter, whatever, or indeed the entire internet service. Will this happen here? There's no sign of it yet, but we're still less than 24 hours into this new world of martial law in Thailand.
Michael Peel from the Financial Times, thank you for joining us. And you can keep up with this story in real time by downloading the ABC News app and starring this story for exclusive updates on the go. You've been watching International Hotspot. I'm Michelle Franzen in New York.